Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Electra and Her Shadow, the third play of Zinnie Harris's This Restless House trilogy. So this is this play would correspond to the Eumenides in Aeschylus's The Oresteia, the third play of the trilogy, where for Aeschylus, the trial of Arrestees happens, with Apollo defending, the Furies prosecuting, and Athena mediating. Here we get something rather different, and again, more in line with what we have in Agamemnon's Return and The Bough Breaks, the first two plays of this trilogy. This is much more psychological. This is clearly modernized, but this is much more psychological, and this is much more focused on Elektra than Arrestees. So that's something that we really get. To a certain extent, we get that in Aeschylus's The Libation Bearers as well, but there Arrestees is really the active force at the end of the play, whereas in The Bough Breaks, Arrestees is not. Elektra is the driving force in Clytemnestra's murder. Electra and Her Shadow takes place after that. Elektra is in a modern mental hospital. She's being treated unsuccessfully. There's a lot of uncertainty in the play about what's real and what's not. And so I'm going to try and make it as clear as I can what's real and what's not real with that big caveat that nothing is clear here. So Elektra believes that she is cursed, and she is being haunted by, in this order, Clytemnestra, then Agamemnon, then Arrestees, who we find out hanged himself shortly after the murder of Clytemnestra, and then the Furies come and attack her. So the doctors are unsure what to do with this, particularly Audrey, who had been Elektra's main psychiatrist, but she was not making progress on the case, and because of her own psychological issues, she actually starts to identify with Elektra, and I'll talk more about that in just a bit. But for that reason, she had to break off treatment. So the doctors are unable even to diagnose, much less treat, what's wrong with Elektra. They've given her antipsychotic medication, but it doesn't work, and Elektra maintains that's because there's no psychosis. She's clearly paranoid, she's clearly anxious, she's experiencing what the doctors believe to be delusions and what Elektra believes to be real visitations from ghosts and the Furies. And so no one is sure what to do with her. None of the treatments have worked, etc., etc. Audrey is going to be leaving this hospital and going to a new job. She decides to go back to Elektra and sort of talk to her again, start treating her again very briefly, which is not necessarily a great plan, but she does it anyway. Elektra's guilt and paranoia about the Furies coming to seek their revenge increasingly shapes Audrey's perception of reality. So Audrey feels a tremendous amount of guilt, and she actually had to undergo psychiatric treatment herself because, as we find out later in the play, her brother had died in a car wreck, almost certainly hit by their father, who was an alcoholic, and he then persuaded / coerced / forced Audrey to take the blame for this, claiming that she was in the car playing with the handbrake and that she released it and it backed over her brother. We get the impression that it was almost certainly their drunken father who hit him. But then the second sort of component of Audrey's trauma is that after years of taking care of her alcoholic father, passing out, throwing up on himself, etc., etc., he eventually chokes on his own vomit, and she doesn't save him. She chooses to let him die. And so as we know from the Bough breaks, in Harris's version of the Oresteia trilogy, Elektra is the one who murders Clytemnestra. So each of these women feels that they need to be punished, feels that there's some sort of external force, the Furies, that are attempting to get to them as punishment for killing their family members. They decide, Audrey and Elektra sort of decide that the only way to escape this is suicide, and they need to do it together because Elektra has tried to kill herself before and it hasn't worked. She says, so Elektra says, if we do it together, we're connected. If we jump together. So this idea that, Elektra and Audrey are having some sort of shared delusion / shared paranormal experience, and Elektra determines that if the two of them, connected psychologically, kill themselves together, that will be freedom. That will be freedom from this torment. So that's what they attempt to do. After, or as they're hanging themselves, the chorus comes in and sets up for the trial of Electra. But unlike the trial in the Eumenides, where each side presents evidence, the chorus have been sent by nature to watch the entirety of the events unfolding, from Iphigenia's murder by Agamemnon up through Electra's suicide. So they've observed everything, they've heard the cases made, and so they come in to give the verdict, basically. But they are deadlocked. Even though there's an odd number of jurors, the votes are even. And so they can't sort of work through this until the spirit of Iphigenia comes. Iphigenia, who haunts all three of these plays. Her spirit shows up in each of these three plays. And the chorus recognizes that she has seen all of the events that they've seen, and so they want her to cast the tie-breaking vote. And she refuses to do this. And the reason she gives is very interesting. She basically says that it has nothing to do with her. That the dead, there are no ghosts, the dead don't compel the living in any way. So, and Clytemnestra had sort of, part of the reason Clytemnestra had murdered Agamemnon was because she believed that Iphigenia was climbing on her back and clawing her back to sort of motivate her to revenge. And Iphigenia says, I did nothing. If you thought I did, it was because you wanted to think that. I'm a little girl. Mom, Dad, is my father here too? I was a little girl. I wanted to play with my dolls. I wanted to run on the sand. I was never a spirit of anything. And of course says, but in your suitcase. And so that's a reference. There's been a lot of talk through these three plays about flowers and the meanings of flowers. For forgetting, for revenge, for steeliness, whatever it is. And Iphigenia says, there's nothing in my suit. There's nothing much in my suitcase. I was murdered, yes, but I never came back. Elektra says, you spoke to me as well. You whispered words into my ears. Hibiscus, hawthorn. Iphigenia says, no, I did nothing. The living drive the living, not the dead. Spirits and gods and demons, we've got no lasting impression, no power to change. Can I play now? The chorus says, you won't vote? She's said what she has to say. She can't say more. Iphigenia says, my vote is for an end. It's to stop. I was just a little girl. Everything else was you. So this is a really interesting piece, because if this is the sort of theology or the metaphysics of the play, it's a rejection of the driving logic of the first two plays, which is that the spirits of the dead, the spirits of the murdered, cry out for vengeance and can compel the living to take that revenge for them. This is really interesting, because it puts a whole new spin on the first two plays. If everything that occurred, all of the revenge, all of the angst, all of the hatred, all of the anxiety that occurs in the first two plays is just psychological, that there are no ghosts driving it, it's simply internalized guilt, then this is very much more a psychological play than it even appears to be from the first two installments. So that's a really interesting point. Couple of other things I do want to talk about here. And then the last scene is actually really pivotal for that, because there's an interesting line. When Elektra and Audrey are hanging themselves, the Furies, the chorus tells Audrey that she gets a trial too, but not today. Actually, I want to go back. Because at one point Audrey says, it's just the dying embers of your brain, don't panic. A final hallucination. So Audrey is trying to explain the chorus that comes in for this trial as the sort of last firing of Elektra's synapses, the last activity of a dying brain. But then we get the whole trial, which sort of gives us this wrap-up to the Elektra story. But then Harris turns a different direction, because the final scene of Electra and Her Shadow is Audrey in the mental institution, now as a patient again, rather than a psychiatrist, talking to one of the other patients. And he says that he had heard that one of the other patients killed herself, and Audrey would have died too if the nurses hadn't been there to save her. So this raises more questions. This undermines any certainty we thought we had even more, because now it's even less clear whether this was genuinely a sort of divine release of Elektra, whether this was genuinely Iphigenia coming to forgive basically the entirety of the family, this tortured house, whether this was sort of genuinely metaphysical, or whether this was whether Audrey was right, that this was just the sort of dying synapses firing in Elektra's brain as she suffocated. We have no way of telling for sure. And so that doubt is really prevalent at the end. But there's a couple of other things I do want to mention. One, very quickly, the first bit that we see in this play is actually the visitation of Elektra by Clytemnestra, Agamemnon, and then Arrestees. And one of the things that Agamemnon says that's really interesting, Electra's trying to get her to tell them how to sort of escape the Furies, or what she can do. Agamemnon says, It's the blood on your hands that brings them. That's what is it's the blood on your hands. That's what is bringing them. Elektra says, there's blood on us both. And Agamemnon says, but my crimes do not insult them like yours. So that's a very interesting point. Because there's nothing... it's not really clear why Agamemnon having killed Iphigenia would be less of a problem than Elektra killing Clytemnestra. The other thing I want to talk about very quickly is Arrestees, because we get this sense at the end of the play the bow breaks, but we get it more here. Arrestees is not committed to the murder of Clytemnestra, and afterwards he says, he describes his actions after the killing of their mother. I went into a panic. I knew the gods were angry. Elektra says, there are no gods. Orestes says, okay, creatures older than the gods even, these terrors and spirits, I heard them. I ran out into the field with a piece of rope. Elektra says, no. Orestes, we broke some rule. I'm sorry, Elektra, when I saw them coming. Elektra says, we're together in this. Orestes says, not anymore. It was your hand holding the knife. It's you they want. Elektra says, you left me. Orestes says, I'm no use to you. I never was any use. Now this is really interesting, in part because it reverses what happens in the Oresteia, which is where Orestes kills Clytemnestra and Aeschylus, whereas in this version he only kills Aeschylus, and Elektra kills Clytemnestra. But even more interesting is that, at least for me, is that Orestes turning away from this murder, Orestes basically sort of denouncing responsibility for it, is a reversal of what happens in Jean-Paul Sartre's The Flies, which is his existentialist adaptation of the Oresteia, or of the Elektra myth, more accurately. And as I said in my video on the Bough breaks, The Flies, I think, is a big influence here, because the flies in that play, flies become a symbol of impurity and of rot in the same way that they do for Sartre. And so, but what happens in Sartre's play is basically that Elektra denounces their revenge. She gives up her existential responsibility for it, whereas Orestes refuses to. He refuses to feel guilt for his actions, and that is what makes him the sort of existential hero of Sartre's play. Here we have the opposite, where Orestes gives up responsibility for his role in this revenge, and Elektra embraces it. But it's not clear, whereas for Sartre it's a pretty simple, you've embraced responsibility for your actions, therefore you are existentially free, you're an existential hero. For Harris, it's not clear at all that Elektra is an existential hero in any sense of the word. She has embraced responsibility to a certain extent, but it's not clear that that has brought her freedom or liberation in the way that it does for Arrestees in Sartre.